Brothers and sisters in the Dharma, and I particularly want to address the Mid-Essex Buddhist Centre. This talk is being recorded for your Dharma night, which is on Wednesdays. I was due to give a talk at the Mid-Essex Centre on April the 22nd, and in honour of that talk I'm talking here in the Abhilasha Shrine Room in front of the big painting of Amitabha, as you can see behind me, opposite the Buddha Akshobhya, and with some of the members of the Abhilasha community. We're all here in retreat pretty much all the time. It doesn't mean that we're meditating all the time. We're working and so on and so forth, and from time to time gathering in the shrine room for Dharma talks. But this is particularly for you in Mid-Essex. As you all know, in the Mid-Essex Centre in South Woodham Ferrers, I've been coming there for some years now, usually with others from Abhilasha. We've driven down and you've hosted us beautifully at the Chinese restaurant, the lovely Chinese restaurant near the centre, and then we've gone to that great centre and I've given a talk and spent time with people, and it's always been a really lovely evening for us. We usually get back very late, but we often feel really quite elated after our visits to the Mid-Essex Centre, because there's such a strong feeling for the Dharma there. There's such a positive and friendly and warm Sangha and spiritual community. And I thought with this talk, because of the coronavirus and the sort of enforced isolation that we all have to keep, that I wouldn't be addressing the Mid-Essex Buddhist Centre. But as you all know, Vanaraji, hello Vanaraji, always has other ideas, and she always wants to hear the Dharma from friends, from order members. And so she wrote to me and said, well, could you please do something in that very wonderful, charming way that you have, Vanaraji? And I couldn't refuse. So I asked Satyakirti to arrange the video recording here, and I invited some of the community members to attend. So this Dharma talk is for you all in Mid-Essex, and hopefully the Abhilasha community members who are here will also benefit from it. Maybe it'll even go a bit wider than that. The theme of the talk, the title of the talk that Vanaraji gave me, is The Great Escape, the Spiral Path. The Great Escape, the Spiral Path. Which is a really wonderful title. It's not just the spiral path, this progressive sequence of states that lead to enlightenment. It's the Great Escape, which is a very, very striking title. It's worth, I think, just reflecting a little bit on this spiral path, this path that describes an ascending sequence of states of consciousness, states of being, which leads to complete liberation from samsara. It's a very, very important, but not very important formulation of the Buddha's teaching, but not given that much prominence in the Pali suttas. It's there in a few places, but not given that much prominence. But it's something that Sangharakshita, that Bhante really noticed. He noticed particularly the work of Mrs. Caroline Rhys-Davids, an early British Pali scholar, probably Welsh actually, but anyway, I'm not quite sure of her nationality, but certainly a British Pali scholar, Caroline Rhys-Davids, who's probably not thought very much of these days in scholarly circles. But Bhante, I remember once saying that reading her works, he felt that she had really tried to feel her way, if you like, imagine her way, and also with great sort of scholarly insight into what the spiritual life of the Buddha and his disciples really was like. And one of the things that she noticed was that this sequence, this description of pratitya samutpada, these links which lead to enlightenment, was there, and I think she even describes it as an oasis of affirmation in a desert of negation, because the general tenor of the Pali records is what is ending. The samsara is ending, nirodha, stopping, which is actually a very positive description of enlightenment, actually, the stopping of the wheel of life. But of course it can sound as though the Buddhist life is just simply a matter of giving up something. There aren't many descriptions of a very, very positive ascending sequence. They're there, for sure, but particularly with the teaching of pratitya samutpada. So Bhante was very taken with Mrs. Rhys-Davids' identification of this particular teaching of the spiral path, the progressive nidanas, the progressive conditions that lead to enlightenment. And it's become a central feature of his teaching, a central feature of Triratna teaching. In fact, I would say that one of the great contributions that Bhante has made to the teaching of the Dharma in the modern world is his emphasis on the positive. That yes, you can talk about giving up, you can talk about renouncing, you can talk about what enlightenment, what nirvana isn't, but that's not enough for us. We need something to put our energy into. We need to be able to develop particular qualities. And whenever Bhante communicates the Dharma, whatever the teaching is, he always tries to find the positive expression. What you actually do in practice, what you develop, what you cultivate. It's a great, great feature of Bhante's approach to the Dharma, which we can take for granted. We can take for granted. We can think, well, that's Buddhism, and it's good if we think that that's Buddhism, because it means Bhante's been successful. But he had to discover and rediscover and re-emphasize these approaches to the Dharma. So it's very important, I think, just to acknowledge again Bhante's tremendous insight, his vision of the Dharma, and how foundational that is for our Buddhist life. So there's a sutta. There are many, many suttas, many discourses of the Buddha, which describe the Buddha talking about pratitya samutpada. But you remember the basic formulation of that. This being, that becomes, on the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become, on the ceasing of this, that ceases. This is the essential formulation of the Buddha's enlightenment. Just in that apparently very, very simple, almost bland formula. This being, that becomes, on the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become, on the ceasing of this, that ceases. That describes the whole of the Dharma. And it's an expression of an insight, a vision, which is actually beyond all language, which is a takavacharo. It can't just be held as a concept. You've got to penetrate this through much meditation and contemplation and reflection, and of course living the threefold path of ethics, meditation and wisdom. That's how you really understand that particular teaching. And you know from your studies that pratitya samutpada finds practical, as it were, expression in the identification of the 12, usually the 12, although there are other formulations, the 12 links that lead to repeated becoming, beginning with ignorance. In dependence upon ignorance arises the karma formations, the samskaras. In dependence upon the karma formations arises consciousness, and so on, all the way round to old age and death. That great sequence which describes the wheel of life and which is illustrated on the outer rim of the Tibetan Bhava Chakra, the Tibetan wheel of becoming. That describes the cycle. So there are many, many suttas where the Buddha talks about that sequence, and just a few suttas which describe that progressive sequence. So as a way into talking about this, and in a way relating this theme of escape with the spiral path, I want to refer to an autobiographical sutta, sort of autobiographical sutta. The Buddha's talking about his early life in a very, very interesting way. And I'm very grateful again to Bhante, because this sutta, he quotes this sutta, or an extract from this sutta, in the Survey of Buddhism. And it made a very deep impression upon me when I first read it. So the sutta goes like this. Before my enlightenment, when I was still just an unenlightened bodhisattva, so the Buddha before his enlightenment is a bodhisattva. That's the Pali for bodhisattva. He's somebody energizing for enlightenment, somebody on the way to enlightenment, trying to discover enlightenment, of course, in his case. Before my enlightenment, before Bodhi, when I was still just an unenlightened bodhisattva, the realization came to me. Alas, into wretchedness has this world fallen. It is born, grows old, dies, passes away, and is reborn. But from this pain, it knows no escape from old age and death. Oh, when indeed from this pain shall the escape be known, from this pain, from this old age and death? A really extraordinary paragraph. What I find very striking about it, the Buddha doesn't, or the Bodhisattva, the Buddha to be, doesn't talk about his own suffering. He doesn't, the realization isn't, alas, I am in suffering. The Pali has the words for into wretchedness has this world fallen. Into wretchedness has this world fallen. Sometimes the way people talk about the Buddha's early life, they characterize it. The Buddha was just concerned about himself and his own liberation. But I think passages like this make it very clear that the Buddha's, the motivation for the Buddha's treading the path to enlightenment, or finding the way to enlightenment, because there wasn't a clear path, of course. That's why his realization is so extraordinary. It was this great concern about the suffering around him and the wretchedness around him. The word wretchedness is very interesting. It's a translation of the Pali kicca, which means distressed, in difficulty, poor, miserable, painful, trouble. There's a lovely Marathi word that, well, it's not a lovely Marathi word, but my friends in India, in Maharashtra, the language there is Marathi. I say, how are you? And they say, oh, Padmavajra, so much trus, which means trouble. Kup trasa, so much trouble, so much anxiety and worry. So this word, kicca, wretchedness, the world has fallen into wretchedness. It's fallen into difficulty. Not that there's some time when it wasn't like that, but it's stumbling all the time, falling all the time into difficulty. And in particular, it's born, it grows old, it dies, it passes away and is reborn. So the Buddha's vision of life is this endless round of birth, aging and death and being reborn. And of course some people might think, well, this is such a terribly negative, a sort of bleak sort of vision of things. I think it's more of a sort of tragic vision. It's not the Buddha that the Buddha to be has a kind of vision of things that's he's just in a bad mood and seeing everything in that light. I don't think it's like that. It's more like the tragedy of life. We're born, we age, we have all sorts of hopes, all sorts of longings, all sorts of desires, all sorts of aspirations. We try to do the right thing. What we see is the right thing, the best thing, and it all goes along. But we age, we get sick, and life comes to an end. And what then of our hopes? What then of our aspirations? What then of our inspirations? There is a sort of tragedy to life in many, many ways. Yes, of course, there's wonderful, beautiful things, but there is a lot of tragedy. And of course, at a time like this, with this weird, invisible enemy of the coronavirus, which is causing so much suffering, so much pain, so much grief for people, so much uncertainty, so much fear, anxiety, so much restriction. We're keenly aware, actually, of this tragic vision. Probably more than ever at times like this, we're keenly aware of this way of looking at life. Perhaps people at this time, because of this crisis, people are asking deeper questions of their life. Well, what is this life for? If this is what happens, because so much of what is been given has been taken away, so much that has been set out for us has been disrupted and interrupted, and the future is uncertain. So into wretchedness as this world fallen, it is born, it grows old, it dies, it passes away and is reborn. And from this pain knows no escape. The word for knowing here is prajna, wisdom. There isn't wisdom. There isn't knowledge about what to do in relation to this situation, and it knows no escape. Very interesting language. The Buddha, the Bodhisattva, knows that there needs to be an escape from this situation. We don't have to accept this state of affairs. There can be an escape. The word for escape is very interesting. It's nissarana, which means going out, departure, giving up, leaving behind, to be freed, to be liberated. It is actually the same word as nisharana, which is, sharana of course is the word for refuge in Buddhism. Buddhang saranang gacchami. The Buddha is the refuge. He represents the escape from the endless round. So escape and refuge are related. And of course what this brings up is that whole, that old chestnut, that Buddhists are escapists, that leading a Buddhist life, this meditation, trying to gain nirvana, trying to gain enlightenment, living as we do here in our little community at Padmaloka, actually quite a big community at the moment. We're indulging in escapism. We're blind to the reality around us. But of course, there is such a thing as escapism, and you can use Buddhism like that. But actually, everybody, I would say, is escapist, in the sense that they don't want to really engage with the fundamental existential issues of life. That's probably what the Bodhisattva would say, what the Buddha would say. You're an escapist if you're not looking at life. If this whole business of being born, of aging, of getting sick, and it ends in death, if you're not engaging with the meaning of life in relation to that, you're an escapist. You can be doing all sorts of wonderful good things, but unless your life is being measured against that, if you like, evaluated against that truth, you're an escapist. You're ignoring the way things are. You're ignoring reality. And Buddhists, if they're real Buddhists, if they're going for refuge to the Buddha, are really trying to engage with these issues. And yes, trying to escape from a repetitive life. Of course, you never escape from aging. You never escape from getting sick. You never escape from death. Not in the literal sense. I mean, the Buddha got sick. The Buddha aged. The Buddha died. His physical body died, although his death was entirely different. His death was parinirvana, as we call it, ultimate nirvana, this very mysterious state. But what you can say is you undergo those things, but what you're trying to do, what you're trying to escape, is being defined by sickness, being defined by aging, being defined by death, coming into an entirely different relationship to those realities, a liberated relationship, if you like, if you can use that phrase, in relation to those realities. That's what the escape consists of. You see this very, very vividly in the Buddha's life, the way he responds to sickness, the way he responds to aging, the way he responds to dying. It's clear, in some ways, he doesn't see it as being sick, as getting old, and even as dying. It's entirely different. The deathless really has been attained, even though he looks as though he's just like everybody else, getting sick, aging, dying. It's an entirely different relationship to that, if you like, an entirely creative relationship to that. So we are concerned with escape. We are concerned with escape as Buddhists. We want to escape from, if you like, the usual way, the mundane way of aging, of getting sick and dying. We want a liberated way of being in relationship to those things, so that we're not in any way defined by those things. So when indeed will an escape be known from this pain, from this old age and death? And then in this same sutta, the Buddha, the Bodhisattva, or the Buddha is talking about his younger days. He says, then the awareness, the mindfulness arose in me. Old age and death exist when what else exists. From what condition arise old age and death? From my wise attention, there came the knowledge, the knowing, and realization, abhisamaya. Old age and death exists when birth exists. When birth as a condition when birth is a condition, arise old age and death. So he then described the 12 nidanas. It's a very, very interesting sutta. He traces it all the way back to ignorance. You know, the old age and death arise from ignorance. That's how we repeatedly become, because of our unknowing, our unseeing. That's how we live this repetitive life. It's a very interesting sutta. No time to go into that sutta now. And then, of course, the Buddha had to go on this great journey, or the Bodhisattva had to go on this great journey of discovery. This great journey of discovery to discover, you know, the origins of this life. We're not quite sure when this realization of the 12 nidanas occurred. Probably with his enlightenment. Definitely with his enlightenment. He's sort of truncating a bit his autobiography. But I wanted to start with, you know, those deep questions that the Bodhisattva has early on in his life, before the full and final discovery of the nidanas that keep us in this repetitive becoming. Because that is where the spiral path, as we call it, begins. One of the things that's very interesting about these progressive nidanas, there's a continuity between the cyclic nidanas and the progressive nidanas. There's a sutta that I'm going to quote a bit later on, where the Buddha shows the two processes coming together, the cyclic, repetitive 12 cyclic nidanas and the progressive, unfolding, spiral nidanas. We'll come to that a bit later. But it begins with, as I'm sure you all know, the spiral path, the progressive nidanas. It begins with this phrase, in dependence upon dukkha, suffering, arises faith, shraddha. This is where the path begins. So it begins with our actual experience. It begins with our life. It begins when we start, if you like, to really become aware of how unsatisfactory life is. In the Buddha's case, there seems to have been this awareness of the world. What is this world for? If it's just born and grows old and gets sick and dies, what's the escape from that? There's this whole sense of the world, the whole meaning of life. Perhaps it won't be like that for us. It won't be so sort of all-encompassing in that way. Or perhaps, then again, it might. Sometimes people do question life generally. But usually there's something more personal that really, as it were, touches us, that gets us really thinking and wondering and searching. There are different kinds of dukkha, suffering, that are recognised in Buddhist tradition. There's what's called dukkha, the pain of pain, the suffering of suffering. It's not just physical suffering, but you're in pain of one kind or another. It might be physical pain, it might be emotional pain, it might be grief of one kind or another through loss. And that gets you thinking, what's this life for? There might be what's called the realization of what's called viparinama dukkha, the suffering of change, of transformation. That you have wonderful things, you have all these good things, you have loved ones, you have a good house, you have a good job, but there's this sort of tension because somewhere it can be taken. It can be taken away. Perhaps people are really feeling that at the moment. That trasa, that anxiety, that trouble, because the good things in life, the really secure things, or seemingly secure things in life, are being really threatened. Well, that can make us think. If we're undergoing that experience of the suffering of transformation, this Sangharakshita's one place calls it psychological suffering. This sort of tension, this stress, somewhere, that it could all go. And of course, we can get pills for that, for stress and worry and anxiety and, psychological difficulties and so on. And we can undergo therapy and so on. I'm not saying that those things won't be useful and important, for some people if it's very extreme. But it could be that it's much deeper than just some kind of therapy or some sort of social adjustment or anything that pills can do. Maybe there is something in you that's recognizing that fundamental insecurity in life. That actually is the nature of things, but you don't have anything yet to respond to with that. You don't have the resources for that. So maybe that first link of dukkha, or that first link of dukkha shraddha, dukkha faith, is engaging with this insecurity much more deeply. But then there's even another kind of dukkha that's mentioned. Sometimes it's called khandha dukkha, sometimes sankhara dukkha. It's the dukkha of conditioned existence itself. It's this sort of sense, even though life is really good, even though life is really wonderful, this sense of being restricted, of being trapped, and that there's much, much more that one could become, much, much more that life could be. One doesn't know what it is, but there's this sort of longing for something more, something much more sort of open and creative, even though everything's fine, apparently. It seems that the Bodhisattva himself was like this. The Buddha in his early life was like this, with this wonderful sort of setup, if you like, he had at home. But there was this deep longing, when indeed will an escape be known? this deep longing for something else. So we need to dwell, if you like, in these kinds of dukkha, not in a miserable way. You need to, be clear-minded and be in a sort of positive state, if you like, be inspired by the Buddha and look. Just look at your dukkha. Dukkha, by the way, one of the etymologies is more, I don't think it's a sort of a strictly scientific etymology, more of a symbolic one. It can be the faulty chariot wheel. Du meaning faulty or ill-fitting. Ka meaning coming from chakra or chakra. So our life can sometimes feel like that. It's like we're going along, seemingly okay, but there are these bumps and it's uncomfortable. And that should be telling us something. It's information. It's revealing that there's something more to life. It's very interesting looking at the Buddha's life, the Buddha's early life, in relation to this particular first sort of stage of the path, the ground of the path, if you like. There's one of my favourite sort of passages in the suttas is where the Buddha describes his early life, where he says, I was delicate. I was most delicate. I was supremely delicate. He goes on to say that I was brought up in such a delicate way, and I had a residence, a home, a house in the rainy season, a house for the hot season, a house for the cold season. In my house there were beautiful lily ponds, lotus ponds with red and white and blue lotuses, and my cotton clothes only came from Benares, the best possible cotton, all soft and lovely. And yes, that was the kind of life that he had, so that he was always comfortable. It was always easy. And even, the servants in his house, in his home, he's being brought up as a prince, even they had the best possible food. So what about him? What about his wonderful food? But it's interesting with the Buddha to be, again, I want to sort of bring out this sense of Siddhartha's, of the Bodhisattva's awareness of suffering around him. It's not just his own concern and the deep longing that sort of develops out of that. In this same passage, which describes his delicacy, his refinement of upbringing, he has these reflections. We're often told in the legendary life of the Buddha of the 4 sights, that he's kept away from painful sights by his father. But I prefer another sutta where you're shown him sort of reflecting. I have almost a picture in my mind of this very handsome, very beautiful young man in his soft cotton clothing and his soft cotton turban by his lily ponds, pondering, reflecting on life. And the reflection goes like this: when an uninstructed ordinary person, though himself subject to old age, not exempt from old age, feels repelled, humiliated, and disgusted when he sees another who is old, overlooking his own situation, now I too am subject to old age, am not exempt from old age. Such being the case, if I were to feel repelled, humiliated and disgusted when seeing another who is old, that would not be proper for me. When I reflected like this, the intoxication of youth entirely left me. I really like this reflection because it brings in other people. He does the same with somebody who's sick and somebody who's dead, and the intoxication that leaves him, and the intoxication with health and the intoxication with life itself. But you notice that language, that when you see somebody who's aging, when you see somebody who's sick, when you see someone who's dead, you're repelled, you're disgusted, you don't want to be with that person. And sometimes people say, when they're they've had that experience of people who they thought they were who were friends of theirs when they've been going through difficulty of one kind or another, sickness or bereavement or something like that. People don't want to be near them. They don't want to be with them because they're not recognizing that will happen to them. So I see in this little story the Buddha's, or the Buddha-to-be, the Bodhisattva's tremendous empathy. He's empathizing with the life around him. And you notice these intoxications leave him when he realizes this. The word for intoxication is mudha, which means honey. Fermented honey intoxicates. That was ancient Indian alcohol. Intoxication leaves him. Sometimes it's called the vanity or even the conceit of youth, the conceit of health, the conceit of life itself. Those things that keep you apart from others. You're drunk on your health. You're drunk on your youth. You're drunk on life. So you become insensitive to others. You become insensitive to the nature of life. So waking up to dukkha, there's something universal in that. It begins with us questioning our own lives, but then we go further. We start to wonder about everybody else. We start to realize that everybody else is in the same position as us. We're less apart from life. And this realization starts to generate shraddha. It starts to generate faith. Faith in Buddhism, shraddha in Buddhism, it comes from a meaning to place the heart upon. To place the heart upon that which is beyond. In the early Pali texts, they talk about the beyond a lot. Nirvana is the beyond. Enlightenment is the beyond. It's a lovely expression. And it's like that at first, isn't it? That, when we're starting, we know that there's something not right. We know we need to do something. We're not quite sure what it is. It's not clear. But we start to search. That's the beginning of faith. Maybe it's even a bit blind at first. It's just an intuition. Maybe there's a tremendous questioning at first. It can manifest in all sorts of different ways, depending on the person. So in dependence upon unsatisfactoriness, dukkha, suffering, pain, arises faith. In the sense of this searching, this journeying. And of course, this can be related to other people. It can be related as well to encountering spiritual friends, encountering the Sangha. It can be related to encountering the Buddha and the great teachers. They can clarify, if you like, our direction, clarify the way forward for us. There are some descriptions of these 12 nidanas, because sometimes other people ask this question, I can't work out how you get from suffering to faith. And there are other versions of these nidanas which fill in the blanks, if you like. They introduce things like spiritual friends, kalyana mitras, dharma friends. They help you to clarify your direction. So we've got a sort of shorthand with these progressive links. There are going to be all sorts of other factors. But what happens is, in dependence upon dukkha arises faith. In the Buddhist context, that faith will eventually start to crystallize. It will start to have for its attention, that faith, the objects of refuge. The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. That's where faith expresses itself, typically in Buddhist tradition. This faith starts to clarify. In fact, there's a kind of faith, a kind of shraddha, called the faith which is a very, very clear mind and heart. The word here is pasadika, the ceto pasadika, a very clear mind and heart. And this is said to arise when you contemplate the qualities of the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. You start to see the wonderful qualities of the enlightened one. You see that they're highly desirable. The Buddha's wisdom, the Buddha's compassion, the Buddha's mindfulness, the Buddha's peace, the Buddha's energy, the Buddha's loving kindness is very, very attractive to you. You see that his Dharma is the way. You see the qualities of the Dharma. You say, yes, this is a path, this is a way that I can follow. It makes complete sense. And you find the disciples down the ages of the Buddha, including even the Sangha in our own times, is the community of friends you really want to be a part of, you really want to enter into. So there's this wonderful feeling of clarity. The analogy that's used for this is, in traditional Buddhism, is that it's like a water purifying gem. You know, in Indian tradition, apparently there are these gems which you can put in muddy water, and the water will become very clear, sparkling, shining, very pure, drinkable. Everything's beautifully reflected. So they say in the same way the three jewels, the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, purify the mind. They cleanse the mind of its confusion and impurities. The way is clear. The way is clear. So you have this lovely quality of faith, which is pasada, this clear, confident consciousness as you start to practice. And of course this faith starts to develop as you take up your Dharma practices, as you practice ethics, as you practice meditation, as you study the scriptures, as you participate in the Sangha. They even say there's another kind of faith that starts to develop, which is the faith which is a very deep conviction. A very deep conviction. Shouldn't be afraid of a deep conviction. But what are you convinced about? It says you're convinced that actions have consequences. In other words, you have conviction in the law of karma, that skillful states lead to positive effects. Unskillful states lead to negative effects for self and others. Very, very simple realization. Where you'll notice that particularly, you'll notice that since you took up Dharma practice, you're changing. You're growing. Qualities are developing. You look back. Sometimes people lose heart. They lose faith. Don't judge things in the moment. Look back. What were you like a few weeks ago, a few months ago, a few years ago? How far have you come? It might even be that other people have to show you that. Maybe spiritual friends, maybe even family might have to say, look, you've got to keep with this Buddhism because you're a much nicer person to live with. I mean, hopefully that's happening during this time of lockdown, that Buddhists are good to live with. I sincerely hope so, that your practice is working in these contexts. The other day I bumped into one of our neighbours and she wanted to talk to me in Sanghanista. She stood in her garden, we were the other side of the hedge, and she was telling us a bit about how challenging it is living with her husband, and how they're really seeing each other's habits up close more than they usually do, and she wasn't finding it easy, and I'm sure there's quite a lot of stories like that going on. But hopefully with Buddhists, it won't be like that, because you'll be changing, you'll be developing, you'll be growing on the path, and you can see that growth and that change. So there's this conviction, there's this trust. This is quite important with this quality of faith. You develop a trust. You can lean into the Dharma much more. You can rely upon it. And that develops another kind of Shraddha, which is called Abhilasha, which is the faith, the Shraddha, which is a deep longing. That starts to grow even stronger. In a sense, your dukkha changes. In a way, dukkha becomes more this sense of more the dukkha of conditioned existence. You feel that more keenly, that you're so restricted by your conditionedness, by your reactive mind, by your unskillfulness, and you long for liberation. You long for liberation, and you long very intensively, because now you have a path and you can put your energy into it. So in dependence upon dukkha arises Shraddha. I should just say with these nidanas, you don't leave the one before, behind. Dukkha and Shraddha will always be there, informing all of the stages of the path. If you like, your sense of unsatisfactoriness grows more and more refined, and your Shraddha goes deeper and deeper. I mean, it's said one of the most refined kinds of sorrow, domanassa is the Pali word, melancholy, sorrow, very refined level, is when you're in the arupa dhyana, very, very refined consciousness. You know, so somewhere like the state of neither perception nor non-perception, extremely refined, formless state. And there's this very, very refined sense of lack of enlightenment. So there you've got dukkha, shraddha, even in that very refined state. Never goes away when you're on the path. It's always fueling you. So this is very important because it means you've got to stay in touch with dukkha, shraddha. You've got to stay in touch with those links. If you're in touch with those, you never settle down in the negative sense. You never restrict yourself. You'll keep up your growth and unfoldment. So independence upon dukkha arises shraddha. Independence upon shraddha arises joy, joyfulness, pramodya. When you find the Dharma, and the Dharma starts to work, when you find the three jewels and they start to work, there's a joy. There's a quite straightforward happiness and joy that goes with that. There's also, it said that you'll develop a clear conscience. This is also mentioned in relation to that, in relation to this, because you're behaving ethically. You've got nothing to reproach yourself in terms of your actions. You're living meaningfully. And there's a lovely, straightforward joyfulness, which of course, you don't just feel for yourself, it spreads. It spreads out to others. So this joy is very, very important. And it's there in all the different descriptions and stages of the path. In the very elaborated stages of the Bodhisattva path, it said that the first bhumi, the first Bodhisattva ground, is the joyful, the pramudita, the joyful. When the bodhicitta, the urge to enlightenment for the benefit of all beings arises, immediately there is joyfulness. And it's a ground, it's a bhumi, a stage. Bhumi literally means ground though. A ground that you can stand on and enjoy this joyfulness because you're living as you should live. So, you know, joy is very, very important in Buddhist life, in Buddhist practice. If we're not joyful, perhaps we need to look, perhaps we need to investigate. Are we living as meaningfully as we could live? We need to ask that question. So joyful. Independence upon joy arises rapture, priti, piti in Pali, priti in Sanskrit. So this is obviously particularly describing what goes on in meditation. The joy gets more intense. It grows into this ecstatic state of being outside of yourself. There might even be sort of physical manifestations of this. There's a tremendous sense of energy releasing and flowing into your practice. Priti can also be associated with interest, being really interested and engaged in your Buddhist practice. There's many different kinds of priti. I don't have time to go into these at the moment, but priti represents this intensification of very, very positive states. Independence upon priti arises prashrabdi. Prashrabdi is very hard to translate. It can be translated as serenity. It represents the sort of calming down of priti. It's a deeper kind of ecstasy, if you like. They say that priti is likened to a great big elephant jumping into a small pond, and there's a great big splash. There's all sorts of effects and bright lights and so on when you're experiencing priti. Prashrabdhi is deeper. If you like, your consciousness is expanded much, much more. And that's like an elephant going into a great lake and there's barely a ripple. There is this serene blissfulness that's pervading your being. And then in dependence upon Prashrabdhi arises Sukha, which is bliss itself. So that's even deeper. So that you've got this progression of very, very positive mental states. And notice the words we're using: joy, ecstasy, or rapture, blissful serenity, bliss itself. Wow. Sometimes, Buddhism can be presented as a sort of, because its emphasis on dukkha, a miserable sort of religion. But this is belying that completely. No, it's the bliss path. It's the blissful path. It's the happy path. Doesn't mean that you're going to be smiling and grinning all the time, but it's the path of deep satisfaction, and yes, even of rapture and ecstasy and blissful serenity and bliss and joy and so on. What this sequence after Shraddha really represent, I think, what they're really communicating is the development of intensely positive emotion. This is one of our stages of the spiritual path that Sangharakshita has identified, the stage of positive emotion. And he really emphasizes positive emotion. And he really emphasizes, for this reason, metabhavna and the other Brahma Viharas, as they're called, of compassion, sympathetic joy and equanimity, as well as faith and devotion. He says somewhere that without strong positive emotion, there is no spiritual life. There is no Buddhist life. He puts it really strongly. And this positive emotion should be really hot and really strong, very, very strong feelings, strong emotions, particularly for others. Very strong friendships, which are expanding. He really emphasizes that. And also emotions that become more and more refined, not just strongly positive, but becoming more refined, more sensitive to one another. So this is really, really important on the path. Really developing a greatly expanded and outward going consciousness that really connects with life around, even when you're sitting on your own, maybe even when you're on solitary retreat in meditation, you still have that very strong positive awareness and impact on the world around you. And this is particularly important at this time. I've been saying in talks about this time, when we encounter difficulty, the tendency is to shrink. The tendency is to shrink back, to become smaller. We've got to resist that. We've got to reverse that and to become expansive and to meet these challenges and difficulties with very, very strong positive emotion and positive actions, generosity, helpfulness, doing what needs to be done, responding to the world around you. And yes, even though it's challenging and difficult, always keeping a joyful mind, as the mind training tradition has it. Always keeping a joyful mind. So this sequence, joy, rapture, serenity, bliss, that is all really to do with strongly positive emotion. And you notice the pleasure that's here. Sometimes, again, Buddhism can be accused of being just concerned with pain, and that you've got to, really watch out for pleasure. You'll find many a Buddhist text which point to the danger of pleasures, that pleasures can ensnare you. But pleasure is really important in our Buddhist practice. Pleasure, sukha, must come into our Buddhist practice. Pleasure is fuel. Pleasure is fuel. The pleasure that comes from skillful action is fuel, is nourishment for our Buddhist life. There's a very, very important sutta where the Buddha describes his asceticism. You know, that period in his life where he was starving himself and doing all sorts of terrible practice to try and get to the truth. That's what he was doing. And he became very odd looking, living in the jungle, dirty, and living this life of starvation, living on 1 grain of rice a day and all these other practices. And it's a very interesting passage because he says that people were saying, Gautama, the samana, the wanderer, the contemplative Gautama, has become a black man. No, he hasn't become a black man. He's become a brown man. No, he hasn't become a brown man. He's become a yellow man. And he said, all because I was starving myself and living out in the open. It's very interesting when you think of the Buddha. How do you see him? Here he would have looked really sort of dark and so on. And I find that detail very, very interesting. We tend to perhaps picture the Buddha as walking around with golden skin, when he wouldn't have been like that at all. He would have been quite dark-skinned, even after his enlightenment, even after this period. I find that a very interesting detail. But here, he's really going through it. And he has this realization, this is not the way. This is not the way. And then he has that wonderful memory. He's saved by memory. He's saved by sati. He's saved by the mindfulness, the recollection of that childhood experience of meditation. When he was eating solid food, he was living well, that realization, sitting under a tree, watching his father plough the fields, that realization where he entered dhyana and something opened up. There's, again, in a later life of the Buddha, of Ashvaghosha, the Buddha Charita, he relates this experience again to compassion. He shows the Buddha to be the Bodhisattva, seeing an old farm labourer ploughing the fields, an amazing description of his bent body and the toil of the oxen ploughing the field and the cut worms. And it's a kind of vision, again, of this toil of the wheel of life. And he feels how sad and terrible this is. It's almost like a dream vision in some ways. And he wants an escape. And then he enters dhyana. He enters rapture. So he reflected at this time of crisis, well, I was eating well then. Where have I gone wrong? I've gone wrong by thinking that the pleasure that comes from skillful action is unskillful. That pleasure in itself is unskillful. And he realizes what a terrible mistake that is. It's a terrible mistake. You need the bliss, the pleasure that comes from skillfulness. Don't reject that. And you're not going to get anywhere by starving yourself. I need to eat. I need to clean myself up. So he took solid food. He cleaned himself up. He had this sense, no, this is the way. This is the way forward. I need to follow this path now. I need to enter the pleasure of higher states of consciousness. So he had a small portion of food, at which point his friends left him in disgust, saying he'd returned to the life of luxury. Of course he hadn't. He'd just taken a small bowl of rice, something like that. And then he recollected that dhyana, that higher state of consciousness, and all the pleasure that went with that. But there's a very interesting detail in this description. He said, but I didn't allow that pleasure to invade and take over my mind. So there's no indulgence, there's no clinging, there's no holding on. And then, because of that, that first dhyana unfolds to the second dhyana. But again, even though that's even more blissful, even more expansive, he doesn't let that take him over. He doesn't indulge that. It doesn't invade his mind. Goes to the third dhyana, same thing, fourth dhyana. And then he starts, having concentrated his mind through dwelling in these dhyanas, these higher expansive states of consciousness, even more pleasurable, deeply pleasurable, he turned his mind. His mind is now flexible and strong, and it can start looking. It can start seeing into the nature of things. So I think this is a very, very important detail in the life of the Buddha, this discovery of the middle way. Sangharakshita has done a very important teaching on reality principle and pleasure principle as the middle way. You need to bring together the reality of living meaningfully with pleasure. Pleasure fuels your pursuit of meaning. In the end, they're not two. Nibbānam paramang sukhang. Nirvana is the supreme bliss. You could say reality is the supreme bliss. In Tantric Buddhism, you have yuganada, the two-in-one of bliss and emptiness. Reality and bliss are not different. They're not two things. If you see emptiness, it will be blissful. If it's not blissful, it's not emptiness. Very, very, and if there isn't emptiness, if there isn't reality, it's not ultimately blissful. So this is very, very important. This is why we put so much emphasis on all these other areas of practice, going into nature, enjoying the beauties of nature, enjoying culture and the arts, enjoying spiritual friendship, enjoying life. In a very, very straightforward, non-clinging, non-attached way. Finding simple pleasures, if you like. Pleasures that are related to a meaningful life. And I hope, during this period, people are not, they're not sort of excluding pleasure in a wholesome sense from their lives. And certainly not from their Buddhist lives. You need to look for that, if you like, higher, more deeply meaningful pleasure in your experience, because it is nourishment. It is the food, the fuel, if you like, of our Dharma life. It's a big subject in itself. So we've come from independence upon dukkha arises shraddha, faith, independence upon faith arises joy, independence upon joy arises rapture, independence upon rapture arises serenity, prashrabdhi. Independence upon prashrabdhi arises bliss. Dependence upon bliss arises samadhi, concentration. What these strongly positive emotions also represent is the total integration of our being. The total integration and absorption of our being. All our energies now are flowing in one direction. There's profound serenity and concentration. It's a very, very powerful, completely expanded mind. So then in dependence upon samadhi arises knowledge and vision of things as they really are. Out of this samadhi, you start to see. You start to look into the nature of things, into the nature of existence. You start to really look into it. It's very interesting when you look at some of the details of realization of the early disciples of the Buddha, the very earliest disciples of the Buddha, when he teaches them the Dharma for the first time. They describe what they call the opening of the Dharma eye, seeing things as they really are for the first time. The opening of the eye of the Dharma, the eye of truth. And the description is very simple. That which begins, ends. Those things which arise come to an end. It's a very, very simple thing. Anything that comes into being passes away. As Sangharakshita's Bhante puts it, if it's a beginning thing, it's an ending thing. In other words, the fundamental insight, the fundamental way of seeing things into the truth of things is into impermanence. Universal impermanence. Things arise, they pass away. Things arise, they pass away and arise. There's arising and passing. It's not that passing is the ultimate either, because things arise. Things come into being, they go out of being. This is happening all the time. This arising and passing. Actually, it becomes very mysterious when you really start looking at it. You try to see where your breath arises and where it passes away. If you get very concentrated in the mindfulness of breathing, look for its arising and passing. It's very hard to see where arising and passing is. Yes, you know it's impermanent. You know it will come to an end at some point. But in the moment, arising and passing is a very, very mysterious thing. In fact, to use the language of arising and passing is a bit of a falsification. So it's perhaps not as simple as it seems. In the end, seeing impermanence is something beyond all words. It is yata bhuta jnana darshana, knowledge and vision of things as they are. And as they are means without words, without language. You use that which arises, passes, but when you look into it, it becomes very, very deeply mysterious, very, very wonderful, very magical, actually. And it's said with this vision that you enter the stream. You become a stream entrant. You become irreversible from enlightenment. Because presumably if you're seeing that, you are never going to fix yourself again. You're never going to fix yourself. I am this person. I can't change. I can't develop. I can't grow. I am this. I will always be this. And life is this. Life is always like this. No. You enter the stream, the Dharma stream, that just leads to nirvana, irreversibility. Sometimes people claim irreversibility because they've apparently seen something. But be a little bit careful with that, I would suggest, because this realization needs to be tested by all kinds of circumstances and changes. We're being tested at the moment because so much is being taken away from us. So much could be taken away from us. If we're serene, responsibly serene in relation to this, and still practicing the Dharma strongly in relation to this, well, perhaps it does indicate some growth in our Dharma life. But we enter the stream. So seeing impermanence is really the key to the mystery of existence. Sangharakshita says in one place that seeing impermanence, when you really see it, when you really know it, well, it's because of impermanence that spiritual development in the Dharma is really possible. So it's knowledge and vision of things as they really are. And then in dependence upon knowledge and vision of things as they really are, arises nirveda. Nirveda, very difficult to translate. Some translators translate it as disgust with worldly things, disgust with conditioned existence. But that's not a good translation. Sangharakshita translates it as withdrawal. You just withdraw yourself from the usual games that you play and that other people play, the reactive games that people play. You just can't be a part of that because you know that things arise and things pass away. He said it's a bit like nirvana is like, growing out of the toys of childhood. You don't give up the toys of childhood. You don't renounce them. You just lose interest. You lose interest in those games. There's no longer any kind of emotional involvement in them. You've seen so clearly. You're not buying into them anymore. You become a much bigger, a much richer person through this insight into the arising and passing of all things. So you can let them go. Another translator translates nirvana as disenchantment. You're not taken in anymore by, if you like, the magic spell, the delusory spell that conditioned existence, samsaric existence, your reactive mind has on you. You're not buying into that anymore. It just slides away. Those things slide away. So that's nirvana. And then in dependence upon nirvana arises viraga. That can be translated as dispassion. Raga means passion. Vi is a negative prefix. So it can be translated as dispassion. I think that can be misleading because it could sound like the highly developed person, the person who's entered the stream, is really cool, and sort of apart and unconnected. And of course it doesn't mean that at all. The Bodhisattva isn't disconnected from others. He's profoundly, or she is profoundly connected with all of life, as we see with the Buddha's own life. I prefer to translate viraga as without concerns, without worries, without being overly invested, again, in the usual doings of this life. Bhante's teacher, Chatrul Sungye Dorje, the name Chatrul or Chetal means without concerns, without any worldly concerns, living free, living an entirely creative life, living entirely concerned with the Dharma, living entirely concerned with bringing the Dharma to others. That's the way he lived. Bhante used to say of him, nobody quite knew where he would be. He'd just sort of turn up and disappear. But the way Bhante describes his meeting with him, it's very down to earth, very compassionate, very concerned in the best sense for Sangharakshita having a proper connection with the Dharma, but in another sense, completely without concerns, not caught up in what's going on around him in a negative sense. And this is one of the great mysteries, I think, of the Buddhist path, of the Bodhisattva path especially, but it's of the Buddhist path generally, of being in the world, but not of the world. This is the image of the lotus. The lotus grows in the mud of the pond, but it grows beautifully above the pond, above the lake. So the Buddhist needs to be in it, really engaged with what they need to be engaged with. And whether it's, working in the NHS, working in different sort of social areas at the moment, whatever it might be, or like us, doing our Buddhist practice here, keeping Padmaloka going, we need to be really engaged and really aware of what's going on in the world around us and in the village around us. At the same time, we're not defined by that. We're not caught up in that, because if you do get caught up in that, you can't help. You can't help anymore. You're dragged into it. You're dragged into the anxiety and the drama. You can be with people in their anxiety, in their difficulties, in their trouble, but you're not defined by that. It's a very mysterious place to be in. I think a bodhisattva and a real Buddhist, a stream entrant kind of Buddhist, a non-returner kind of Buddhist, they're very, very hard to understand, because they are, as it were, almost in two worlds, with us, and yet there's so much more that's just not defined by all this. Very, very mysterious, very hard to understand, I think, who the Buddha really is, who the bodhisattvas really are. I often used to feel this when I used to go and see Bhante. I'd feel he was with me, particularly when he could see that I was in difficulty. I really felt his empathy and his concern in the best sense. And yet, I always had this feeling there was something unfathomable about him that I couldn't reach, that wasn't defined by all this. Very mysterious state. That's the place that we need to be in. In the end, of course, the Bodhisattva is in both samsara and nirvana. The nirvana in the Bodhisattva path is called the nirvana that isn't situated anywhere. It's not situated in nirvana, it's not situated in samsara. It transcends that way of looking at the world. Independence upon viraga arises liberation, freedom, vimukti, complete liberation from any kind of definition. We're going now way out beyond, we're already way beyond what I can really talk about. But that is the end of the Buddhist life. Complete liberation of the heart, the liberation of the mind, no definitions, no boundaries. That's where this spiral path leads. A non-boundaried state, complete liberation. Very, very mysterious indeed. It's not liberation in any kind of social sense or political sense. It's not like that. It's an entirely, as it were, spiritual, to use that word, dharmic liberation. Doesn't matter, even if you were locked up in a jail, you'd still be liberated. Even if we had to spend the rest of our life at Padmaloka, not going anywhere, we'd still be liberated if we'd reached this stage. Our mind, our heart, has no boundary at all. And of course, it's related to love. It's related to compassion. The liberation of the heart is said to be metta, mudita, karuna, equanimity. That's the greatly liberated state. The liberation of wisdom means there's no distinction between self and all others. You no longer live in that dichotomy. There's still a further stage. In dependence upon this liberation arises jnana. Well, actually, it's the jnana that knows that the biases, as they're called, the ashrivas, the poisonous fluxes that keep you unenlightened, that are the unenlightened state, have been destroyed. The fluxes that drive you to compulsive sense experience, the fluxes, the floods that drive you to a fixed state of being, and the fluxes that drive you to ignorance, they've gone. All that has vanished. And there is this radiant jnana. It's the way Bhante describes this in the Three Jewels. He says the emphasis here is on jnana. Wisdom, knowing, that is not separate from love and compassion. It's a radiant, non-dual awareness. The primordial, pure, self-originated shunyata jnana. Shining, radiant in all directions, that can never be diminished, can never be broken. That is where the great escape takes us to, through following this spiral path. And I'm going to end this talk for the Mid-Essex Buddhist Centre, for your Dharma night, with the Buddha's song of victory. This is apparently, according to some traditions, the first verses that the Buddha ever sang after his enlightenment. Many a birth have I undergone in this process of faring on in the round of conditioned existence, seeking the builder of the house and not finding him. Painful is such repeated birth. House builder, now you are seen. Never again shall you build me a house. Your rafters are all broken, your ridgepole shattered. The conditioned mind too has gone to destruction. One has attained to the cessation and liberation of craving. Thank you.